Everyone, and welcome to the FamilyKind peer-to-peer series. Today, I'm happy to say that we are collaborating with the LGBTQI family professionals of New York. You'll be hearing from three revered professionals on the topic of unique issues in LGBTQI parenting and impacts on divorce and separation. We are able to bring you this peer-to-peer webinar series, which is for professionals, free of charge, because of the generosity of our two sponsors, our Family Wizard and SoberLink. Our Family Wizard is a comprehensive app that enables you to conduct all your co-parenting communication on a single platform. Powerful tools document your parenting time, reimbursement requests, payments, exchanges, and more. This means less conflict and more energy to focus on your children. SoberLink supports accountability for sobriety and child safety, combining a breathalyzer with facial recognition and wireless connectivity for real-time results and reports. SoberLink's new family assistance program offers alcohol monitoring free of charge to anyone who qualifies. By increasing our total reach in our mission of supporting families affected by alcohol abuse, this program will help continue to reduce litigation and foster peace of mind. I am now thrilled to introduce today's panelists. Today, we have Teresa Calabrese. She's a mediator and collaborative lawyer concentrating her practice on serving LGBTQ people and families. Teresa assists individuals, couples, and families in creating agreements relating to relationship formation, family building, separation, and divorce. Teresa also handles second parent adoption matters and provides basic estate planning services. We also have Barbara Rothberg. She has been a family and couple therapist for 40 years, and in the last decade has dedicated much of her practice to serving as a divorce mediator, family specialist, and working as a parenting coordinator privately and with FamilyKind. Jessica Rothberg, like Teresa, is a mediator and collaborative attorney and founded her family and divorce mediation practice, Mediation Works, Inc., over 20 years ago. Jessica is active in her professional communities and enjoys bringing people together in venues like this to share knowledge and perspectives. You may notice that Jessica and Barbara share a last name, and there's good reason for this. They are an amazing mother and daughter team, often speaking on professional panels together. So without further ado, let's get to the heart of the matter. Jessica?
Thanks, Leslie. So happy to be here. And don't be fooled by the gray hair. I am the daughter in this duo. So welcome all of you. This is a really exciting topic, and we are just excited to bring this ever-evolving legal landscape and just really digging into kind of the unique emotional impact and issues that, that occur when we're working with LGBT clients. So before we get started, I'd love to get an idea of who's here, and in our webinar way, we're going to throw up a poll. So if we could do that now and take a moment to answer the couple of questions that you'll see in front of you. And then we'll let you know the results of that. Okay. So, oh, this is interesting. So we've got a little more than half, 60% attorneys, I think you can all see as well. Is that right? Yep. And then we've got almost a quarter social workers, mental health practitioners, just a few financial professionals. Thanks for coming. And then other. We also have, looks like a significant number of folks who have at least some experience working with LGBTQ clients. So we look forward to a really exciting seminar where you can also ask questions toward the end. And so just a few housekeeping points about that. There will be a chat open. That said, we're really trying to save our questions for the end, and we will be making time for that. For those of you who have seen me moderate panels before, I'm a stickler for that, so I will make sure that we do leave time. And at that point, you can certainly put your questions in the chat, and we'll try to answer them as best as possible. Okay, so to get started, we want to just make sure that we're all clear on language as it relates to kind of LGBTQ families, individuals, just as a way to understand the diversity that exists in our communities. And oh, just as, sorry, one other housekeeping note that's important, because this is a really tight-knit community in a lot of ways, both professionally and also in the communities that we live. And so we just want to point out that any hypotheticals that we use during the program are really just that, hypotheticals. And so sometimes it will come up in terms of case studies and stuff, but we just want to make clear that those scenarios are really just drawn from our experiences and not real people. So with that, I'm going to toss it to Teresa, who's going to talk to us a bit about cultural competency and other good stuff. Thanks, Teresa.
Yes, and it's always great being on a panel with Barbara and Jessica. And so I'm excited to be doing this today and looking forward to, sharing information with all of you. I just want to say, like, we know that some people in the audience are also LGBTQ people. So even though it might seem like, the cultural aspect of doing these programs, it's always important to us to do cultural competency, because even as members of the LGBTQ community ourselves, we learn from our younger clients, we learn from other people in our community. And so we feel like it's important to always expand our own knowledge. And so we'll continue to do that. And then I just want to say the word community. Jessica used it. I use it all the time. Barbara probably uses it too. Like when we use the word community, I just had this because I heard this on a podcast the other day, that community brings people together, but it can also kind of diffuse that there is diversity. So just to point out that there is diversity, right? And that's part of doing this, right? The competency and language, that our community, because I said it again, because I'm trying not to say it, is very much a diverse group of people, right? So LGBTQ people are, people who identify as lesbians, people who identify as non-binary, genderqueer, transgender, gay men, gay women. There's so many different ways that people identify. And what we want to emphasize is not making assumptions about your client's identity, right? If you're working with your clients or even your colleagues, like, to really be clear on who they are and use language that is reflective of who they are. Check in your assumptions about gender identity. There's such an expansive spectrum right now, right? People aren't, the binary is not as common as it used to be. And so, I might have clients who identify as male or female. I also have clients who don't identify as male or female, and somewhere along the spectrum. And so I want to make sure I'm clear when I'm meeting with clients, who they are. And so, like, what I do, like, I have forms that are just, sometimes they're gender neutral, and sometimes when I need information from my clients, like just very demographic, name, address, that kind of thing, I ask, what is their pronoun? Ask gender identity, so that I'm not, it just becomes like a regular part of my practice, and I'm not making assumptions about that. So I think that's really important.
Speaking of assumptions, Barbara, can you talk about something that happened with you with clients?
I just a little prelude. What Teresa's saying is so important. It's so important to give our clients a safe space so they feel emotionally that they could say whatever they want and be whoever they are. And we have to have our thinking has to be expansive, and we need to be inclusive. And I'm going to tell a little anecdote of a situation that happened to me. I tried very hard to be open and expansive and being part of the community. I think I have a basic cultural competence. And here's what happened to me. I had two young women come into my office, and it was actually for couple therapy, and they were talking about whether they should marry or not. And there we're in the middle of a session. At a certain point, I just made some kind of statement saying something like, well, in a lesbian relationship, and one of them just jumped at me and said, what makes you think we're lesbians? And I was like a little taken aback as two women were in my office together talking about getting married. And I said, well, I apologize. I didn't mean to label you. Please tell me, how do you identify? And they said, we're queer. So that's how, and they were insulted by being called lesbians. So it really taught me, I never have done that again. And it really taught me that I need to ask people how they want to identify, how they identify, not only pronouns, but in terms of how they see themselves. So it's really
Yeah.
important.
And that's a really good example too, how even with the best intentions, right, we can, you know, make some mistakes.
Yep. And it's good to apologize. And I want you to know, apologies go a really long way. And when I said to them, I sincerely apologize, they could accept it.
Yeah.
And it kind of also goes to like things like use of the word queer, dyke. You know, people identify, like I always use queer and dyke for myself, but I know people who would be like horrified by the, you know,
Insulted by that term, sure.
so it's really what's comfortable for your clients.
That's
If I
right.
can just say this, Jessica, just for a second, I had a client once who, a transgender client, and I was a review attorney for a mediation, and I was reviewing the agreement. There was something about her pronouns, so I made some comment to her, and I said something to the effect of preferred pronoun, and then we talked, and she said, you know, I just want to let you know that I don't have a preferred pronoun. I have a pronoun. And kind of like that really blew me away, because at the time, like I thought the correct lingo was preferred pronoun. And what she said made so much more sense, right? Just my pronoun. And so that really resonated with me. And you know, so I like to tell that story because I think people don't necessarily know.
Yeah.
So I think we know what to say. We don't always know the right things.
Yeah. And that's okay.
Yeah.
We're learning. It's all a process. And I think importantly, just to make a little segue into our family structures are also really diverse in terms of how we form our family structures. So can you talk a little bit about that as well?
Yeah,
Teresa?
I think in like sort of following with that relationship identity as well is really critical, because again, like our clients, you know, have whatever their relationships are, right? So we might have clients who are long-term monogamous relationships, or, you know, non-monogamous, but they have a main partner, or they're polyamorous, domestic partnership, right? Married. I mean, there's so many different ways that people identify. And it's really important in terms of people's relationship identity that you do know what their, it's like, how do they identify, but then what is their legal status in terms of their relationships? Because it could really impact their parental rights, as that practice tip below says. And so, you know, you might have clients who have been together for, you know, 20 years, but they've only been married for 5 years because of marriage equality. Or they've, you know, been together for 20 years and they're not getting married. Or younger clients who, a lot of people are getting married pretty quickly these days. And then you have people like me who I'm married, but I always refer to my spouse as my partner. That's just the way we've always done it. So I never call her my spouse. But Jessica,
unmarried, often call my partner my spouse, my wife. So
yeah, so
it depends on the context.
Yeah.
So that's just another example of how everybody labels themselves the way they're comfortable. And there's no right and wrong way.
And again, just making it a regular part of your practice to confirm with your clients and really make sure when they say my wife that they really mean that legal status, or if not, that, you know, you're just confirming their legal status.
Yeah. So how did we get here, Teresa? How has history supported or not supported our unique families?
Yeah. All right. So in terms of our families, right? So LGBTQ families, people build their families in a lot of different ways, right? So family structures look, there's just such a wide range as you might expect, right? So kind of a typical one is a lesbian couple. And we're going to talk mostly about lesbian couples. Lesbian couple using an anonymous sperm donor to build their family. Often they use a known donor. Sometimes there's one person is trans and they've either harvested eggs or they store that person's sperm before transitioning. Or it could be a gay male couple who are using a surrogate. Co-parenting between people who are not in a couple together, right? They could be really good friends. They could be, same-sex friends, and they could be opposite-sex friends. There's so many different ways that people build their families, and that's like really fascinating for us. Like we like that. I don't know. It's like I really enjoy.
Teresa, the other piece of that is so often people are sperm donors. Sometimes are involved with the families, and sometimes they're not. And again, that's up to the couple because sometimes they have a friend who becomes a sperm donor, and that man is it like an uncle or be a part of the family. Other times it's an unknown donor, and other times it's a known donor who has nothing to do with the family. So again, there's so many different structures, and there's not a right and wrong in it.
Right. And also sometimes you have like three parents, three people who are co-parenting together, and sometimes it's even a lesbian couple, gay male couple who are going to co-parent together, and they're figuring out how they're going to do that. The thing about family building, and I think it's important to keep this in mind when you have clients, especially I think maybe on the divorcing end, is to really think about like that people in the LGBTQ world, like they don't generally get pregnant by accident or like have kids by accident. It's a very intentional thing. It's very thoughtful. It's very purposeful. There's like a lot that goes into planning, and just understanding that wherever you find your clients, whether they've been together and they have a 10-year-old kid and they're splitting up, or their kid has, one of them is about to give birth and they're splitting up, that connection with the child, with the whole process has gone on for many years before that kid was conceived. And there's a lot of like, it's emotional, it's financial, right? It's like part of the community.
Legal. I said it's legal.
Yes, it's legal. Yeah, there's just so much that goes into it, from like monitoring your ovulation cycle, like the scientific end of things, choosing sperm or known donor, anonymous donor, however you're doing it. It's just, there's a lot. And so I think as professionals, we have to really recognize what went into this family building, what went into it and what went into it emotionally for our clients. Do you agree, Barbara? Is there anything you'd add?
I do. And there's something I want to go back to something you mentioned. You just kind of very quickly said something about 3-parent families. And you said very quickly something about 3-parent families. And I think sometimes couples are building 3-parent families by choice, where there are either 2 women and they bring a man into it who is a sperm donor and they decide to co-parent together. And I've worked with a situation where there were 2 men who brought a surrogate into the family and she was part of their lives. And the other thing is that as gay lesbian people, we have different kinds of structures that are not traditional and they can change. And especially with divorce, the structures change because people separate. And there's one situation I worked with where a donor who was a known donor and had peripheral relationship with the children. There were 2 kids. When the couple split up, one mom was having a lot of issues taking care of both kids. She had a very busy job, and she asked the guy if he'd like to be part of their lives. And he decided, yeah, that would be great. So then they became a 3-parent family. After the children were, I think, 5 or 6, they were school age. So it was really interesting that structures can change, which again is very non-traditional, but it ended up, we figured out ways to make it work. So I think it's important to look at, there isn't a fixed structure and one way to do something.
And pointing again to the importance of not making assumptions, and practice tip, right? Checking ourselves as practitioners, even if we know, for example, the structure and we find out, okay, there's maybe an unknown donor or a known donor, let's say, and then don't make an assumption that just because there's a known donor that we know exactly how that person fits in or doesn't fit into the child's life. So these are all really important topics to explore with your clients to the extent that it's relevant to the work that you're doing with them.
Yeah, and also just not if you're meeting with clients on the front end, like when they're building a family, if they're doing through mediation, collaborative practice, or through therapy. Like just also, people, what I've discovered is even if it's a situation where I think that people are crazy that they're going to co-parent together, like it's just I don't know, like it just doesn't make sense to me, but I know they're going to do it, right? And so I'm going to work with them and do the best I can to provide them with the best services, give them information, help them to see some of the stuff that, some of the bumps that they might encounter, but just really recognizing that whatever our opinion about it, I mean, unless it's something really egregious that we feel unethical or something, but in this situation, it might not be what we would, do in our family, but people, there's room for everybody, and
There is, and there's so many stereotypes, and how can you bring in somebody else to start parenting? And in a traditional family, if there's a split and you bring in a grandmother, nobody will question that.
Right.
And you're bringing in another adult to help out, but that doesn't get questioned.
Right.
Or in wealthy families, when you have a full-time nanny, that doesn't get questioned, and that person becomes a major person in the children's lives. But because that's traditional. And we do it through a friend family, or we do it in the way gay people do it, it's often looked at as strange. And I think it's important to look at the larger concept that it's really not strange. It's maybe getting assistance in a positive way to build families in ways that work. And there's no one way.
And I know Jessica's going to want us to move on in a minute, but I just further is that people, like, I think people communicating with each other and really talking it through, like what their family is going to look like and what their intentions are, it goes a long way. And so if I've had couples where, not couples, like friends who are going to co-parent together but not be in a relationship together. Good. I've had people who are going to co-parent not co-parent, a donor who's not going to be the dad, but his family is going to be involved as the grandparents and aunts and uncles and all that stuff. And, like asking those questions, like, how will this work out? Are you comfortable with this? Have you thought this, just to make sure that your clients have really thought it through, because it's true. People, there's this expansive way of doing things, and people are going to do what resonates with them and what's important to them. And we have that, I think.
Yeah, well, that's a very good segue, Teresa. Thank you. Which is that I think, as we'll learn later, that the law and I think also sort of our mental health systems are catching up somewhat to the variety and diversity of LGBT communities. But I think before we can get there, it is important to know, again, how we got here, right? So kind of if you can give us a little kind of primer on just kind of the historical legal landscape and again, what brought us to where we are today.
Yeah, so you said it in a really great way, Jess, because historically, the law, does not contemplate LGBTQ families, right? We're just not part of that equation. And so we've been trying to fit in it, and that's been very frustrating. I mean, we've had some good things along the way, but it's still a frustrating process. And it's also, it just, as Barbara will talk about in a little bit, like just the mental toll on people for constantly having to fight for their rights, it's a lot. So in New York State, historically, the way parentage was established is through biology, adoption, and then the marital presumption of parentage, which is basically that if you are, like, the person who is giving birth to a child is one parent, and then if that person is married, then that person's spouse is the other parent. And so so LGBTQ folks typically, like historically and typically, did not fall within that, right? Biologically, two parents couldn't, if they're same sex, could not be biologically related to the child. adoption was not available to LGBTQ folks, and definitely like second parent adoption didn't exist yet, which I'll talk about in a few minutes. And the marital presumption didn't apply because there was no marriage equality. Um, Domestic Relations Law of 73, which is the legitimacy of children born by artificial, I think it's called in this artificial insemination or alternative insemination. That was really meant for, again, for heterosexual couples using assisted reproduction in order to get pregnant. As long as it was on consent, the husband would be presumed to be the spouse, even though they didn't conceive, through sex. And so that really, I mean, we use that law to our advantage now for that as it applies to marriage equality. But again, it was not considered, we were not considered when that law came into effect. So what happened, even though we've had these constraints in the law, it didn't prevent people from having kids, right? People still had kids. And so what they would do, and I'm going to just stick with like the typical lesbian situation. So lesbian couple decide to have a kid, and they talk about whether to use a known donor or an anonymous donor. And then they go about and do that. And one person, the person giving birth, is the legal parent. The other person is not. There's no way to legitimize that relationship. And they just hope that things, they're happy, they're co-parenting together, life is good. It sucks that their child doesn't have two legal parents, but things are good. So that worked out, unless it didn't, right? So then if there's conflict around this, that like the couple breaks up, right, then you have possibly the birth mom saying, no, I'm not going to let you see the kid anymore. And historically also the courts have not been friends of the queer community. So people didn't want to go to court to fight things out because they weren't respected. There, discrimination, people, all kinds of stuff that people had to deal with. So they would stay away from the courts. And one of the things that would happen is those of us in that community of friends or people who, like professionals like myself, would say, tell your friend to talk to your ex and, kind of shame them into like, stop doing this. We would call them the bad lesbian mothers. It's true, right? I mean, we all know people who went through this. We all had
peer pressure.
Peer pressure. And so that's what people did. And sometimes that would be helpful and sometimes it wouldn't. But in 1991, this lesbian, Allison D., she and her partner had planned to have a kid together. They did all the, preconception planning and choosing the term and all that stuff, and decided that Virginia would be the person getting pregnant. They go through it. Virginia gets pregnant. They have a kid. They're co-parenting together. I think when the child is like 2, they split up. They're still co-parenting. They work out an arrangement. It's fine. And then at some point, Virginia just decides to cut off the contact between Allison D. and the child. So Allison to go to court to file a custody and visitation petition, and ends up at the highest court in New York State, the Court of Appeals. And basically what the court says is that she is a legal stranger to the child because she does not have a biological relationship or adoptive relationship to her child. And this case was a heartbreaking, devastating case for LGBTQ families. And it was this like horrible legacy for 25 years. So, I mean, anybody practicing in this area, everybody, like clients, everyone knew the LGBTQ case. It was really like just this terrible, terrible precedent that, people really had their hands, judges had their hands tied, people had their hands tied every time there was a conflict like this. So that was in 1991, so that's terrible. But then a little positive thing in 1994, I think it was 1995. The Matter of Jacob, Matter of Dana Court of Appeals case comes into effect, and that is a second parent adoption case. So in that case, what happened is the court said that the same-sex partner of same-sex parent wait, let me just get the same-sex partner of a parent can adopt that person's legal child. So I hope I said that right. I might not have, because I should have practiced.
Yes,
Um, and so
on consent.
yes, on consent, right. And so the great thing about that is it's a way, like Allison D and Virginia M did not have second parent adoption available to them. Maybe that would have changed everything if they were able to do a second parent adoption. Maybe they would have, right? So now you can adopt your partner's biological child. Your partner has to consent, but your partner is never surrendering her rights. That's a really big thing. And so we're all really happy to have that, right? A little bit of a downside is that it is expensive. Mostly people hire attorneys to do it. You have to go through a home study, which is invasive. The adoptive parent has to go through a criminal check and a child abuse registry check. And so those are all kind of invasive processes. But again, there is like happiness that you are legitimizing that relationship, which is really important.
I have a few things to say in regard to
Mhm.
this. Just to go back to Allison D for a minute, because the concept of legal stranger is really such an intense feeling for someone who is the non-biological mom. And everybody doesn't do second parent adoption. Just like you said, Teresa, it is expensive and it's horrendously invasive. I mean, when a heterosexual couple has a child, they don't have to do a criminal check. They don't have a family study of the home study to look at the home. They don't go through the things that a lesbian couple does. And even if a couple is married now and it's legal marriage, they still have to have a second parent adoption for safety. So a lot of people choose not to do it, even though it's not.
And we'll talk about that later, everyone. So hold that. I know people have questions.
All right, I'm not a lawyer, so the lawyers will talk about it.
Back to you, Barbara, for the psychological effects.
Okay. The fact of if one person remains a legal stranger to the child, imagine how that feels. Because when two parents decide together to have a child, it's, as Teresa said before, it doesn't happen by accident. It happens with enormous amount of time, of energy, of discussion, of money. It's not cheap. It's definitely not cheap to have a child through any kind of artificial reproduction. It's all these methods are very expensive, and also if it doesn't take the first time, it's extremely disappointing. And then you have the emotional fallout of, oh my God, I'm not pregnant. And then you have to deal with that. It's not an easy thing. So when a couple finally does it successfully, at that point, the other parent becomes a legal stranger. It's horrendous. It's just, and it has such a terrible impact on the relationship. For example, you have two moms pushing a stroller, and the two of them are very happy, and they're walking in the street, and somebody says, well, who's the mom? And they say, we both are. And then it depends on who the people are and how they react. They have to deal with the reaction of what people are going to say when they say we're both moms. It doesn't validate their relationship. It makes them feel bad. It makes them explain. And you shouldn't have to explain the fact that you're the mother. But women who are to a same-sex couple often has to explain all the time. And the impact on that has a negative effect on the relationship, because then people feel competitive, they feel jealous, they feel angry. It breeds all kinds of anxiety, and then a relationship ends up having issues, which is unnecessary. But this is because society has not yet caught up to the fact that it's okay to have two moms, just like it's okay to have a mom and a dad. So that's my 2 cents here.
That was good. So
Thank you.
Did you want to say something, Jess?
No, go ahead. Go ahead, Teresa.
Okay. So, and then Barbara alluded to the greatness, I guess, not the greatness, that's not the right word, but the order of adoption, right, is entitled to, full faith and credit recognition throughout the country. And it does, unequivocally confirm the legal rights for both parents, which is great. So moving along in terms of like progress. So then we have
if that happens, it gives enormous security when people do go through second parent adoption. there is much more security that both of them have a legal tie to the child. And if they do split up, they're both legal moms. So that makes an enormous emotional difference to know that they are legally as well as emotionally connected to the child.
Right. So in 2011, we have the Marriage Equality Act in New York State, which is also progress for us, obviously, a big deal, having marriage equality. And one of the main benefits for us in New York is that it means that the marital presumption of parentage applies to same-sex couples too. So that means that, you know, if a same-sex, like a lesbian, that same lesbian couple are married and one of them gives birth, then the spouse is presumed to be the child's parent, the other legal parent. So that's great. It's not a tight seal because it's a presumption, so it can be challenged. One of the things about the marital presumption is that it is a state statute, and so every state has their own marital presumption statute, and so we don't have a guarantee that it will be that a New York State marital presumption statute will be applied, you know, in the same way in another state. And I think that, you know, sometimes I feel like those of us who practice in this area, we're just paranoid about everything. But, you know, we're used to having our clients and our families be very marginalized. And so we do that like full protection as much as we can, or, you know, recommend that to our clients, because you don't want to end up in like Arkansas, and Arkansas doesn't want to acknowledge the marital presumption from New York because they don't want to acknowledge a same-sex couple, that you know, the two women as parents or two men as parents. So we take extra precautions, and for that reason, I just want to say that with the marital presumption, both people are on the birth certificate. Again, a great thing. I mean, it's like a lot of progress with having the spouse on the birth certificate, who's the non-birth parent, and that could be, you know, for New York purposes, yes, you are the parent. But again, like a birth certificate is a record. We assume, and it should really get full faith and credit recognition throughout the country, but they don't always. And so it's not enough to have a birth certificate. That's why we continue to recommend to our clients that they do a second parent adoption, because that order of adoption does get full recognition across the country. And there's actually a Supreme Court case that affirms that. So it is the way to do it. I'm going to talk about the Child Parent Security Act in a minute, which is related, of course, to this topic.
Yeah.
So as we...
Yeah, do you want to jump into some of the more recent case law? And
yeah, I was thinking that would be good.
Okay, go for it.
So in 2016, we finally have a court case at the Court of Appeals level that overturns the Allison D case. As I said, that was a 25-year terrible legacy. And the Brooke SB case, it's a similar case. It's an unmarried same-sex couple who plan to have a kid together. They did all the preconception planning together. They have the kid, and then the birth parent cuts off, when they break up at some point, the birth parent cuts off contact with the non-birth parent and the child. And what the court said is that if the partner can demonstrate by clear and convincing evidence that the parties agreed to conceive and raise the child together, then that person, that non-birth parent, can seek visitation and custody. So that issue of your legal stranger no longer exists if you can show that that a preconception agreement. And the great thing following the Brooke SB case is that there have been other cases that have kind of expanded on the definition of parent, which there's one case that actually talks about a 3-parent family and looking at the intention of this family to co-parent 3 people. We're co-parenting this child for 10 years, and you can't now, 10 years later, say this child only has 2 parents. So that's like a really amazing follow-up to the Brooke SB case. And then it's also like typically and historically with donor sperm agreements, we do them and they're really important to show the intention of the parties. But we always tell our clients that, if you're in a court battle with a donor who decides he wants to be a dad, like we can't guarantee that a judge won't say he's a dad. The judge always has the option to review any agreement related to a child and will apply the best interests of the child standard. So it's always a vulnerable place until you actually do a second parent adoption where he can legally surrender his rights. But we've seen some cases come out of the following Brooke SB where donor agreements were actually enforced. I think most of them involved parents who were married, where the intended parents were married, but still it's a good thing and it feels like a positive, very positive step. And as Jess said earlier about the law slowly catching up to our families, and these cases are an example of that. I know this is a very quick kind of overview.
Yeah, and I just, Teresa, do you want to just also mention the CPSA briefly? And then I want to hear from Barbara about how these, family structures really impact our clients, psychologically as well.
Can I just make one comment before you go to CPSA?
Sure.
You talk about, Teresa, you mentioned best interest of the child. I mean, look at the case law. And one of the things that happens when people split up, people are often very angry. And the best interest of the child tenant, which is of course what we all work with, gets so lost. Because a child who has had a relationship with another person for many years, all of a sudden a bio parent might say, hey, this is my child. And they forget to think about the fact that this child has a relationship and it's going to be an enormous loss if this other parent isn't there. And we have to remember the importance of best interest of the child.
Thanks, Barbara. Yeah, so as we were saying earlier, the law did not contemplate our families historically. Last spring, the New York State legislature passed the Child Parent Security Act, and it's going to be in effect on February 15th. And this really, this is where I think the law really is catching up. It's really, this law has considered our family. And I think it's trying to kind of, instead of having us with this struggle of, having to go the extra mile all the time, it's really trying to move away from like biology and adoption as the main form of parentage and look towards the intention of parents. And so we're all really thrilled under this. I'm just going to kind of look at the slide and go through it. What we're doing is looking at preconception intent. It's kind of following the Brooke SB case a bit as the method to determine who is a parent. So in those donor agreements, which I'm always telling my clients I'm not sure will be enforceable, now I can say this can be enforceable. This is a preconception agreement that demonstrates that the donor has donative intent, which means he's not going to be a parent, and under the statute it will be enforced. It's a way for non-birth parents to also be able to enforce their rights because the intent, the preconception intent to determine who the parent is there. It's establishing the legal relationship between the child and their parents through assisted reproduction only. So that's something to just keep in mind because, if you have sex to conceive, that the Child Parent Security Act does not apply. It's not usually an issue for most of our clients. It can be, but most of the time it's not. But so it's really meant to serve our interests. It also recognizes one parent families, which is a big thing as well. So in my examples, I don't know if I fully said these examples, but I've had a few cases where a woman wants to have a kid, does not have a partner, and she has a good friend who's often a gay man who says he'll donate sperm, but he does not want to be the dad. In those situations, there's no way for him to fully and completely legally surrender his rights because the legal surrender happens at the point of second parent adoption when somebody else is standing in his place to adopt the child. So people do, donor sperm agreements, and the ones I've done have never come back as any problems, but it's kind of frustrating for people to not be able to articulate that and have that legal status. But under the Child Parent Security Act, you can get what's called an judgment of parentage, establishing, or I should say, affirming that you're a one-parent family, which is really important. You can also do a judgment of parentage instead of a second parent adoption. And this is meant to kind of to make, first of all, make the process cheaper and less invasive. So this proceeding does not have a home study, it does not have a criminal history check, and it doesn't have a child abuse registry check. So those things are really important. I don't know like how much less expensive it will be. I mean, there won't be a home study to pay for, but we haven't seen the forms yet, so I don't really know what it will completely look like. But the idea is to make it less burdensome on families so that they can still come out with an order, but not have to go through the same process as second parent adoption. So it's supposedly, like a less demeaning process. The other thing is that there's what's called a voluntary acknowledgement of parentage that you can sign as the non-birth parent, and you don't have to be married. The law applies. It's not only if you're married, a married couple. The presumption is there in terms of intended parents. And so being able to do the acknowledgement is great because we don't have that ability right now. And that was seen as a way to make it affordable for people who can't afford to hire an attorney to do the proceeding, which is messed up, but at least we have something. And I feel like there's something, so I guess the one other thing I want to say is that so this is great. We're really happy. I'm completely thrilled about this. There's still a little ambivalence about, is it better to still do a second parent adoption? What's our opinion going to be? And I've talked to a lot of different people, colleagues. I've talked to people who are involved in the legislation, and everybody says, if you really want to be sure, do a second parent adoption. I think time will tell as the law is effective and we have clients willing to take that chance and do the order, because really the main concern, will it be recognized throughout the country? And it should be, because it is a judgment of the court. And so it should get that same recognition as an order of adoption. But we still have that, a little bit of hesitancy. But
We're not there yet.
I
said we're not there yet.
Someday, I hope we will be there completely. Yeah. So
if I could just jump in for a moment, Teresa, we're making good time, and there's a quick question that came up regarding second parent adoption, and I thought maybe you could speak to it, which is, and I know that I said not to put questions in the chat, but I'm going against my own rules. In any event, around the criminal checks and things, what kinds of infractions would bar second parent adoption do you know? I mean, other than maybe the obvious, I guess it's just a question of like, why should, other than, is it a child abuse kind of a, registry thing that happens with divorce, but it seems like it's more intensive for a second parent adoption.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny, like I don't know what would prevent it other than like something very, very serious regarding a child, maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah,
but the point is that criminals are able to be parents, right? Who are straight criminals.
Not if they're gay.
Right.
I've had a couple of cases where my clients have had criminal histories, and in one case they didn't tell me, and so it came up when they did you have to get fingerprinted, so it came up that it was like a shoplifting thing that happened 10 years earlier. So then I talked to her about it. We did an affidavit and explained it, and that was the end of it. I think I had some other case too where my client did tell me in advance, so we just disclosed it. That was a drunk driving arrest.
Yeah, but I think it's important to point out that straight people never have to deal with a drunk driving issue or any kind of criminal kind of intent. That's a small thing. That society has not caught up and imputes all these negative things to gay and lesbian population, and that's really.
And Barbara, and that's like a good reason to say try doing a judgment of parentage instead of a second parent adoption, because you don't have to do a criminal check. You don't, and even if you don't have a criminal history, just out of principle, like not having to go through that process. I mean, I think a lot of times I look at it as like, what if it were my kid now, what would I do? And, I mean, I would probably still do a second parent adoption until I saw how this parentage proceeding unfolds. And hopefully it's fine. And I mean, there's going to be a little bit of like judges are going to have to get used to it. And so far, like they don't seem to have any instruction about it. And so there'll be, some like bumps along the way. And, but I'm sure people will be willing to take that chance.
Well, it's all
Yeah.
new.
And
I think the one word, the CPSA is all new, and we don't know how it's going to happen. But if it does in a positive way, it'll really give enormous security. So people will know emotionally that they're protected. And I think that's so important.
yeah.
And I want to say one other thing, although I hear Jessica saying, yeah, she wants us to move on. Sorry.
Go ahead.
To talk about this, I'm just going to mention it, that the other very big piece of the CPSA is on surrogacy, which has been illegal in New York. I don't really know much about surrogacy. I know a tiny bit about the CPSA and surrogacy, but it's not my area at all. I have colleagues I refer cases to, but just as a quick thing, under the CPSA now, you can have a surrogacy agreement that is enforceable, but the surrogate cannot also be the egg donor. So you have to have a separate egg donor, and then implanted in, the egg and, the
Embryo.
egg and the together. Thank you. The embryo is implanted in the surrogate. Thank you. And then that is a legal agreement, and it's an enforceable agreement. And there's lots of parameters around it. It's supposedly like a very, very protective of the surrogate, provides like a surrogate's bill of rights. It's very groundbreaking in the terms of surrogacy laws, which I understand is really great. But I can't say more than that because it's not my area, but it does, the gay men in our community too.
Yes, and that's a whole other very fascinating area of law that does often impact LGBTQ clients as well for obvious reasons. Thanks. So I do want to just spend our last bit of time before we jump into questions to really dig a little deeper into these unique family structures, so that our folks that are listening can really do their best to kind of understand and work with, our clients as best as possible. And I know, Barbara, you spoke earlier just about kind of the psychological impacts of the competition, who's the real mom and the bio mom versus the non-bio mom. Can you just speak about that a bit more? And one quick thing that I just wanted to, my own little anecdote, when my children were young, and in kindergarten, really, young kids, and there was a child who said, "Oh, your mom's here," and another kid said, "Well, that's not your mom. Like, your mom was here yesterday," and he said, "I have two moms," and another kid said, "Oh, lucky." Right. So that's awesome that in kindergarten, the kids are, we're not usually met with such enthusiasm as adults. But the point being that as adults and kids, there's a constant coming out process. And that's something that I think is really important to understand if you're not living in that reality. So maybe you can speak to that a little bit, Barbara.
Perfect segue, because that's just what I'm going to talk about. That society has not really caught up. There's a lot of confusion, and it's same-sex parents are not the most typical. So there's always explaining, there's always justifying, there's always letting people know what's the legitimacy of it, and it's constant. For example, if there are two moms at a soccer game watching a kid, and they see another parent, they wonder who's the mother. So then you have to deal again with two moms. Or if you're in the schoolyard, again, it's two moms. Who is the other mother? Who is the other person? And there's a constant explaining. You have to explain this to the teachers. The teachers have to know that there are two moms, so the kids get some support. I'll talk a little about that in a second, but I have a very funny anecdote to talk about. People should have the right to come out if they want to or not. And one mom told me a very funny story that her 7-year-old answered the buzzer on their doorbell for the bell rang, and she was buzzing somebody in, and the guy said, "It's the plumber." So, and he heard a little voice, and the plumber said, "Is your mommy home?" She said, "No, but my mama is." So here we have, this couple's now out to the plumber, who they didn't really plan to come out to. So as lesbians, you don't always have a choice because kids ideally are open and free, and you want kids to be able to say what they want. But then the parents had to go deal with the fact they had to deal with the plumber, and the plumber looks at both of them and whoever whatever he thought. But you don't have a choice, is the point. And Jessica just told an example about a schoolyard, and another mom told me a very similar example, but again with confusion. Not it wasn't like how lucky, but a mom went to pick up her child at the schoolyard, and she had a 5 or 6 year old, and she was with her best friend. And the little girl said, "Well, who's that?" She said, "It's my mama." She said, "But your mommy came yesterday. Who you told me yesterday that curly haired lady was your mommy?" She said, "That was my mommy. This is my mama." And so this little girl has to then explain, and she has to show the legitimacy of her family. And this little child has to deal with Father's Day cards in school. And this little girl has to deal with the fact that there's a family tree. And how does she put everything down? So you want your children to be open and comfortable, but society hasn't yet caught up. And depending on the teacher and on the school, it can have a tremendous hard impact on kids. And you need to be able to talk to your kids constantly about the fact that your family is different. You don't have a daddy and a mommy. You maybe have two mommies, and this is okay. And you have to be reassuring. And we obviously need to change attitudes, and we need to make it valid and helpful. And we don't want conflict in the parents' relationship because the parents have to be both on board. They have to be both on board with how much they're out, who they're out to. They're in this breeds competition. Who's going to pick the child up? Maybe the other one should pick the child up. Maybe only one person should pick the child up. It leads to so much conflict in so many families. And then there's the grandparent families. And how open are the grandparents? And what does that mean? And what does that do? And how do we validate that? These are all hard issues. And as
Yeah.
mediators, it's not our job to work on these issues, but it's our job to understand that they're there so we can validate the problems and let
Yeah.
people look where they need it.
Yeah, thank you. I was just going to say that I think as practitioners, depending on the role we're playing, just having an understanding of, some of these experiences that exist for our clients, then you can, kind of determine to what extent you're right, that matters in terms of the role you're playing, but having that understanding is really, having that context is really important. And maybe Teresa, can you just mention, I'm thinking about the attorneys, mediators, collaborative, and how this is, these are great venues, these sort of well, maybe you could speak to that a little bit, Teresa.
Yeah, I mean, I think that for a lot of different LGBTQ family issues, right? Like family building cases. So when people are coming together to do a donor agreement or a co-parenting agreement between people who aren't a couple, doing that, engaging in mediation or collaborative practice is a really great way to do that because it gives you, like, for those of us who practice mediation and collaborative, we know that, our clients are the central part of that process. They are the ones who are making the decisions. We're helping them identify the issues and talk about the issues and share their perspectives and really flesh out those issues. And I know for me, and I've had a couple of donor or co-parenting cases where one was in mediation, one was in collaborative. In a mediation where the brother of one of the person not getting pregnant was going to be the donor. And as we went through the mediation, the first session, it seemed like it was becoming clear to me that it was going to be a little problematic. There was just something about the dynamic with the brother, there's something going on. And they ended up not going through it. And they called me later and said, we're not going forward together. And I think that it was the process that helped bring, that dynamic to the forefront in whatever his perspectives are that they found challenging. I had a collaborative case with.
Teresa, that's because you were able to really you knew about the situation. You could really expansively talk about it.
Yes.
Which is really important.
Yeah. And actually, Barbara, I'm glad you're doing this because I am going through things kind of quickly. I think that is the thing about the process is you're exploring so much with your clients. Right. And even though a lot of times they've done a lot of work before they even come to see professionals, we have a way of bringing things up, right? Because we have experience with other clients, like things like like where I've had a number of cases where a married straight man is going to be the donor for two good friends, lesbian couple, and the straight couple has kids of their own, and talking about like, what does it look like for you, for all of you with your families and the kids, like the lesbian couple wants the kids to know, their kids to know, their history, and this person is their donor. How does that work for your kids? And the donor being very like, well, I don't think my kids will know anything until they're like teenagers or when they're old enough. So there's stuff to work through, and we work through those issues. So it's really important. And when sometimes people decide not to go forward together, that's definitely a positive thing, right? Because they've realized that it's not going to work out.
I want to make a
you want-
comment here too, because it doesn't always work out. And I know a situation where a woman got pregnant with her partner's brother's sperm. And this way they were both children were biologically connected to each family, and each grandparent was biologically connected to the children that they had, which is a great idea until they split up. And if they split up, this causes a lot more chaos because you have biology on both sides. And this is where it's really important to have families who talk through all the possible issues to see that things may happen. Everything isn't perfect.
And it also, like on the other end, like when people are splitting up, like sometimes, you can have a case where there's, they haven't done a second parent adoption, for example, and the couple are splitting up. And again, I'm going back to the lesbian couple, and making sure you talk about second parent adoption or order of parentage, whatever, people, both, I guess, so people are aware of both proceedings, but reserving that right to do the second parent adoption, because people might not want to do it right now, but down the line, they might realize it's an important thing to do. And so that's something that's really important. And sometimes you run into problems with the court, because I had a case where the hearing officer didn't understand what second parent adoption was, didn't understand, like we had to do additional affirmations to explain why we were reserving that right, which also brings me to like, a lot of my younger clients, they're married, they have the marital presumption of parentage, they'll have the CPSA and the intent, they are the intended parents and have that legitimacy in the law. They don't want to do second parent adoption or an order or a judgment of parentage. Like people are like, no, there's a different kind of fight, whereas those of us who've been around, we're like, do everything possible, right? I'm enforcing my rights under this statute.
Yeah.
You have to honor that, right? And just encourage them to leave the door open, because it's important to protect them, their family.
Yeah. Thank you. That's really helpful. And on that note, I do want to just spend the last few minutes really going through some practice tips, because I think that's really important and why we're doing these types of webinars. And so I'm just going to put some slides up around really, again, practice tips. And we're already getting some great questions in the Q&A. So I don't know if you want to kind of read through these. TC, Barbara.
Sure.
Well,
Yeah.
Teresa, you talked about the first one. It was really smart. Preferred pronoun.
Yeah. And so actually, oh, sorry. A question did come up in the chat earlier. I think this is really important because sometimes people tiptoe around sort of, not wanting to ask the wrong question or say the wrong thing. And we talked about that in the beginning. But so here's just some really basic, questions, just straight questions, simple questions that you can ask your clients. Just in terms of getting an idea of, again, their status and lots of the stuff that we've talked about today. We also talk about, checking yourself, right?
I'd like to make one comment here about who the real parent is. And all the research with attachment theory always talks about bonding, which is certainly very important in the first few years of life. but children can bond to more than one person. While they definitely children need a primary person, that doesn't mean that they're not going to bond to a secondary person as well. And that the real parent doesn't have to be just the biological parent. I work with one lesbian couple actually where the biological mother had a very, very busy job, and the non-bio mother was the one who took off 6 months from work, and she became the primary bonding parent, even though she was a non-biological mother, and it was fine. And both mothers had very strong bonds to this child.
Mm-hmm.
And, I just want to just like an anecdote about myself, if that's okay.
Please.
Just on this issue of the real parent or the relationship between, biology versus or birth parent versus non-birth parent. So I'm the non-birth parent of my now adult child. And I remember, I don't know, when she was like a toddler or something, I went to a bar association continuing legal education program on adoption, like just regular adoption, because I thought, I don't know anything about it. Maybe I should branch out from just second parent adoption. And the person who was the moderator said, anybody who is adopted, raise your hand. And then anyone who is an adoptive parent, raise your hand. And like afterwards, I realized I didn't raise my hand, and I was an adoptive parent. I had to adopt my child. But what that said to me is that this idea that I never think of myself as an adoptive parent. Not that there's anything wrong with adoptive parents, obviously, but that I don't think of myself that way. And my daughter certainly doesn't think of me that way either. And so we as professionals have to think about that too, because I never really thought about it until that happened, like how my whole perception of myself is not as an adoptive child. So it kind of goes a little bit, I think, Barbara, to the real parent thing.
Sure.
Yeah, and how the law is sort of applying these terms that don't necessarily fit kind of psychologically.
Yes,
yeah.
Right. Which is why intended parent works well.
So in the last 5 minutes, I'm just going to kind of share a final screen here around, again, kind of final practice tips and things. And Teresa, if you want to just take a few moments and then we can jump into some Q&A, which I have a few to read. Oh, yeah. Sorry, everybody.
Just that understanding that LGBTQ people are still marginalized in many ways. And, those of us who do live in New York City, sometimes it can feel like a bubble, but then sometimes it's not, because, New York City is not one big friendly community all the time. Transgender folks can be biologically related to their children. Queer married couples.
A second, and a transgender man can give birth.
Yes, that's right.
It's kind of an oxymoron, but it has happened.
Absolutely. Yeah. Not everybody does a second parent adoption. Not everybody gets married. Like those assumptions that now that there is marriage equality, that everybody gets married. And then sometimes you have to educate the court system. It might feel like we still have to do this. Like that seems so crazy. But, you get a JHO who has never heard the term second parent adoption before. And my thing about it is like, I know sometimes people get angry, like educate yourselves. I think we all need to educate ourselves. But I also feel like I would prefer educating people than people just making assumptions and then doing the wrong thing, right? If it means that I have to explain something, I'm okay with doing that because at least the person's asking questions, right? And that's really important. And maybe I'll just leave it there.
Yeah, I think that's good. And I think, I think what we're all saying is really just honoring, our clients' experiences and recognizing that they might be different from what you're used to. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you. This has been really informative. And I do want to just kind of read through some of the questions that came up, and we'll direct it to the appropriate panelists. A few questions around, so the requirement that conception occur via ART means that the parties must have engaged. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm reading the question. So about using a medical professional, or can people kind of go the turkey-baster route? And, is that sufficient? And how does that, what are the kind of the legal implications, if any, of using a medical facility versus kind of doing it on your own, if you will? Or is that even possible these days?
Yeah, no, it's still possible. People are still doing it.
Turkey
Yeah.
baster.
Yeah, yeah. Really a smaller syringe than a turkey baster, though, right? Just saying. Because I thought it was going to be a turkey baster.
If somebody's trying it, right?
What was that?
Not a
in case
turkey
somebody
baster.
tries it.
Yeah, so a lot of people go through fertility clinics, which gives you additional, it's like an additional layer, I guess, of support because you had somebody facilitating the whole process. But you can still do it at home inseminations. Sometimes I have had cases, not that often, but where the judge wants to know more about the at-home insemination, not like details in the way that we might think, just confirm, like an affidavit confirming that the people did the insemination at home by themselves. Like they got the sperm, however that you know, whether it was through a sperm bank or a friend, and then did the insemination at home.
Yep. Okay, thanks. Jumping a little bit, can you talk about the judgment of parentage and kind of how that works is procedurally, just in terms of, it's not really part of the step of settlement, right? It's more of a parallel process. Can you just talk about that or how that?
Yeah.
And that might be for a larger conversation, but just maybe if you have some.
Yeah, I mean, I think the idea, like in cases that I've had, what we do is we put in a paragraph. Well, we actually make it clear that the people, the parents are the legal parents, right? Because we want to make sure there's no question, because that's, I mean, even though we did that in that case that I had where the JHO questioned the relationship, but you want to be really clear that they are recognized as parents under New York state law. I mean, assuming that's true. And with the Child Parent Security Act, that's going to be, you know, easier to do. But then you want to reserve, say that, you know, despite this, they're aware that second parent adoption or a judgment of parentage is a recommended proceeding to engage in, and just explain that they're going to leave that open. They may not be doing it today, but they both agree that whichever parent wants to do it, they will consent and go forward together. And then if you're doing a donor agreement, though, like if you're on the front end of it, you would also put language in. And actually I do it now, it's like both the judgment of parentage and the second parent adoption, like just and or, because I don't know what people are going to choose. But I am happy to talk more about it. If people have questions and want to email me, that's fine.
Thank you, Teresa. And perhaps I can punt this one to you, Barbara. And that's also given your long experience, both personally and professionally. Do you find that New York schools and like physicians' offices are kind of more supportive to more than two-parent families at this point, or kind of what has been your experience in terms of dealing, you know, at least with your clients dealing with these kinds of entities and things?
I think it's
like sending, you know, to everyone, oh, sure, of course we'll send 2 or 3 copies of everything, you know, things like that.
It's erratic. I'd have to say it depends a lot on the school and it depends on the teacher. I'm dealing with a situation now with the school that they say they'll only send to one home. This is like straight or gay. They'll only send information to one home. They're too busy. They can't do this. They can't have more than one email. So that makes things, for any divorced family, makes things very hard. Other teachers bend over backwards. I've heard teachers read stories to young children about gay families and about 2 moms and talk about it when they talk about families and talk about being inclusive. So I think a lot of it depends on the teacher. And I think it's really important for parents who are same sex to go talk to the kids' teachers and tell them and say that they want a positive environment for their child and advocate and maybe come and volunteer to talk to the class and talk about their family and be open and talk to the school, because some people need education and we need to help them be educated.
Yeah, thank you. Just a couple of quick questions for you, Teresa, on the CPSA, and a specific question about, does it apply retroactively? Families, for example, if you have children and are married, can you then file for like a judgment of parentage on that kind of day 1?
I believe it does. And I'm
Okay.
glad that that person asked. Thank you for asking that because I forgot to say it.
Mhm.
But that is my understanding, yes, which is great.
Okay,
too.
great.
Yeah.
Okay, and I'm just seeing if there's we probably have a few more. Oh, here's one. As to custody and visitation when it comes to agreements on consent, do you think that a jurisdiction clause for New York as a home state would circumvent issues for states that don't recognize same-sex and home state rule? Did you follow that, Teresa?
Yeah, but I mean, what do you, isn't that issue?
Yeah.
It's really an issue of where the child is living, right? I don't know if you
Yep.
can.
I was just going to
circumvent
say
that.
it. Yeah, I was just going to say I think that that's a jurisdiction issue, right? Of where the kid is.
Yeah.
A bunch of people are asking about the slides and all that, and
But can I
the
ask a question?
yeah,
Can I ask a question? In terms of jurisdiction, what happens if it's part-time, like for COVID? What happens if they're living in Vermont?
primary residence for 6 months, right, Teresa? That the the child's primary residence for 6 months establishes jurisdiction. Is that?
Yeah, I don't think temporary would work, but I don't really know. I'm not,
Just
but that's a good point.
Yeah.
Thank
so many crazy things with relocation now because of COVID, and so many people have left the city for a period of time that it's opening up a whole bunch of new issues.
Yep.
I think
Indeed.
that, I mean, I don't want to talk like an authoritative figure on this, but Jess, maybe you have an opinion too. Like, I think if you're, like, I have a case right now where one of the parents is living out of state because of COVID, and they've just reflected in the agreement that that's the case for now, that she and the child are not permanently relocated. They live in New York City. They will be back, like, just to make it really clear so that there hopefully won't be any, I mean, that hopefully there won't be a jurisdiction issue down the line, right?
Right. I mean, I guess the question, we don't know. It's been untested, right? And if that turns out to be less of a collaborative situation and more of a, marriage story situation, American Marriage, what was that called? Anyway, you know where I'm going with that. Another quick question regarding second parent adoption. That one practitioner mentioned that that she had understood that there was often that these can get rejected. What is your experience in terms of, or at least that the court has discretion to grant these second parent adoptions? Can you talk a bit about what your experience has been, and if there's been any issues around approving adoption?
Yeah, I mean, I have never had a case not go through, and I've, with the exception of like 3 cases, I've never heard of cases not going through in New York City. The 3 cases that I am aware of are cases where the people, there are 3 separate cases, excuse me, each one, the couple, lesbian couples, they were all married at the time their kid was born. So the marital presumption applied in New York State, and the judges all refused to do second parent adoption because they said that the marital presumption applies. They're both legal parents. There's no reason to do the adoption. One of the judges, I think, was trying to be very progressive about it and say, like, this is established already. So, I'm doing this progressive thing and denying the adoption. But what was missing from that is that the marital presumption is not necessarily, national, and, so you're not getting that extra protection. And I was like following those cases. I was part of, there were 5 cases in Kings County where the judge wanted to actually he wanted to write a decision about this issue. So he selected a few of our cases, all involving married couples who gave birth during the marriage. And he basically wanted to write a decision on why it's important to continue doing second parent adoptions and why judges need to keep doing it. And so he did that, which was really great. But it didn't help, like in Queens, where some judges didn't want to do them. People would cite to that case, show them the brief, and they would still deny it. But actually, there has been a change in the law, and I'm sorry, I can't remember where it is, but it doesn't matter if you're married. The marital presumption does not prevent doing a second parent adoption or a judgment of parentage.
Right. So in the early years of marriage equality, there were some questions, but now that's kind of been resolved, at least in that area with the court. Yeah.
Yeah. Other than that, I have never heard of cases being denied.
Okay, so even though the courts have discretion, they pretty much, these adoptions
I
are
mean, it's
approved as far as.
very
And
conservative.
we're only working in New York too. I guess, things could be different in other states. I also just wanted to speak for a moment that we, a couple people just made some comments around the idea of the kind of child residency requirements and jurisdiction requirements. Neither Teresa or I really practice in the court so much, so forgive us. There might be other, factors there. Some people are pointing out. So just want to, lay that to rest and point that out. Yeah. So, yeah, we're almost out of time. I don't know if either one of you, Barbara or Teresa, you have any kind of final comments before we close out with a few housekeeping items. But
I mean, I think just mainly, talk to your clients, ask questions. Don't worry about making mistakes, right? Your clients, they might get a little annoyed sometimes, but for the most part, it's better to, make a mistake and then correct it and move forward and make sure you're providing the best services for your clients, and keep educating yourself, coming to forums like this and other forums, keep up with, the constant changes in the law. Yeah, Barbara?
yeah.
Two things to say. One is to kind of piggybacking on what you said, Teresa, being aware and being open to learning new things. And the most important thing is don't make assumptions. And in my field, whether it's about people, whether it's about communication, making assumptions is dangerous because it's not necessarily what somebody means or somebody feels or somebody thinks. So ask questions. So I always say to people, don't make assumptions, ask questions.
Thank you. Also, a bunch of people asked in the chat about having access to the PowerPoint, the slides, which you will get. Have some patience that the recording and the slides again will be available once they are, polished. So those will be coming your way. There also, importantly, and I meant to mention this earlier, but there will be an evaluation that's going to be posted in the chat that we ask that you do take a few minutes to please do fill out. That's really important. It really helps FamilyKind and all of us, or all the organizations, work better together. And also importantly, just a plug for FamilyKind that these peer-to-peer events will be happening. The next one is on Monday, February 22nd. And just to be clear, they will be going back to a shorter format. There will be 1 hour. So they used to be 45 minutes. Today was a long, but they will be a 1 hour format from 1 to 2 p.m. Also, for all you social workers out there, FamilyKind will be offering a contact hour in the near future. So that's great. The topic of the February 22nd, 1 p.m. FamilyKind peer-to-peer will be marital mediation. So that'll be a good topic. And the speakers will be an attorney mediator and a mental health professional. The attorney mediator, Anna Lisa Gertner, and Rich Heller, the mental health professional, will be joining. And also keep in mind that FamilyKind is a great resource for your LGBT clients. So don't hesitate to contact them. They really worked hard to ensure that as an organization, they can serve the queer communities. And so please do send your clients their way. And so again, the evaluation is in the chat. Please do take some time to fill that out. And it was really a pleasure to work with you all to do this.
Thank you all for coming and joining us.
Yeah.